Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time.
Today, we're doing a really crucial and I think often uncomfortable deep dive into Barbara Ehrenreich's 2009 analysis, Bright-Sided, how the relentless promotion of positive thinking has undermined America.
And our mission here is really clear, right? This is not a feel-good chat about smiling more.
Not at all. This is a systems-level look at optimism, not as a personality trait, something you're born with, but as a mandatory, pervasive social system, a deeply American ideology.
Okay, let's unpack that right away, because that framing completely changes how most of us think about optimism.
Yeah.
You're saying it's not just a nice habit.
We're investigating why this whole discipline of positive thinking functions less like genuine emotional support and far more like a kind of ideological control.
A system that demands compliance.
Precisely. The book forces you to see how this ideology, in its modern, really aggressive form, actively undermines the kind of critique we need. It encourages disastrous risk-taking, and maybe most cruelly,
It blames the individual.
it ruthlessly blames individuals for failures, layoffs, disease, financial ruin that are fundamentally systemic. It's a structural critique that cuts across culture, corporate management, medicine, everything.
And that structural critique is what makes Ehrenreich's work so powerful.
Yeah.
Before we get into the mechanics, let's talk about her. I mean, she has a long history of exposing these kinds of vulnerabilities.
Oh, absolutely. Barbara Ehrenreich is one of the country's most renowned social critics. She's an investigative journalist who is just known for her piercing analysis of American life.
She always focuses on the structures, not the people trapped in them.
Exactly. Most listeners probably know her from Nickel and Dimed. That was her deep dive into the sheer impossibility of surviving on low-wage labor.
And again, it was never a critique of the workers. It was an expose of the system that kept them poor.
Precisely. And then she followed that with Bait and Switch, which looked at white-collar vulnerability, the futile pursuit of the American dream in an age of constant downsizing.
So she has a pattern. She investigates systemic failure, not individual shortcomings.
Yes. And that's what makes the origin of Bright-Sided so powerful. It actually started from a very personal place for her.
It began when she was diagnosed with breast cancer, right?
Yeah.
And she was sort of forced into this culture of relentless cheerfulness.
That's it. She details this shock in the very first chapter, which has the stark title, Smile or Die.
Wow.
She was diagnosed and immediately ran into what she calls the pink sticky sentiment, this hyper-feminized, relentlessly cheerful pink ribbon culture. She was just stunned by the mandatory nature of it all.
What did that look like?
She describes the waiting rooms filled with inspirational poems, the constant talk of fighting and winning, and, this really disturbing image of a breast cancer teddy bear with a pink ribbon stitched to its chest.
A teddy bear. That really says it all, doesn't it? It signals that this horrifying experience is meant to be packaged and performed as this sweet, optimistic journey.
It's a signal that the culture is less about actually coping with the reality of chemotherapy and, potential death, and more about complying with a very strict emotional script.
The prescription against certain emotions is what really struck me.
Yes, that's what she found so jarring. Any anger or sadness or just a straightforward acknowledgement of fear, it was all treated as counterproductive, toxic even.
The word victo was basically forbidden.
Ruled un-PC. You could only describe the sick as battling, fighting bravely, or hopefully survivors. The message was crystal clear. Your emotional state directly controls your physical body.
So illness itself becomes a moral issue. It stops being just a medical event and turns into this, spiritual test of your attitude.
Absolutely. She points to this pervasive belief that survival was, axiomatically linked to attitude. She even cites a study where a staggering 60% of survivors attributed it to being positive.
So patients feel this immense pressure to perform these mental exercises.
A huge pressure to do visualization exercises, imagining their cancer cells as weak and confused, and their immune cells as strong and aggressive soldiers.
That sounds absolutely exhausting. I mean, on top of fighting a life-threatening disease, you're now required to perform this constant internal mental labor.
It's an enforced psychological battle on top of the physical one. And the truly dangerous flip side of that mandatory attitude is what happens when you fail.
The moralization of failure.
Exactly. If the cancer spreads or the treatment fails, the implicit message is just devastating. You weren't positive enough. You failed the moral test.
That is just textbook victim blaming, but it's sanitized with this kind of spiritual self-helpy language.
It is. Ehrenreich quotes a psychiatrist who saw patients being told by well-meaning friends, If you got cancer, it's because you didn't deal with something emotionally.
And that kind of thinking just so conveniently shifts the focus away from any structural factors.
Like environmental carcinogens or lack of insurance or a delayed diagnosis. It puts the entire burden, success or failure, right onto the patient's internal mental state.
So if we really want to understand how this ideology got so entrenched in American culture, we have to look back. The book traces its roots way back as a reaction against one of America's founding beliefs.
We have to go back to the 19th century. Chapter 3, The Dark Roots of American Optimism. The whole idea of systematic positive thinking really came about as a cultural and theological counter-reaction against the grim, punitive, guilt-ridden theology of Calvinism.
Which dominated early American thinking. Remind us of what that Calvinist anxiety felt like.
Well, Calvinism was all about the terrifying idea of predestination. God was often seen as capricious, full of hate, not love, and any suffering you had on earth was probably a sign of your sinfulness.
Ehrenreich calls it a kind of socially imposed depression.
It was a culture of constant self-monitoring for signs of damnation, just paralyzing fear about your eternal fate.
So naturally, the pendulum swung hard in the other direction, away from sin and damnation and toward a search for peace and, well, material reward.
Precisely. And that swing led directly to the rise of what were called the New Thought movements.
These weren't secular self-help yet, right? This was more philosophical.
Quasi-religious, really. You had figures like Phineas Parker's Quimby and then Mary Baker Eddy, who founded Christian Science. They basically posited a benevolent, abundant universe.
They called it supply, almost like an economic term.
They did. And in this view, illness and poverty weren't divine punishments. They were just temporary delusions that you could correct with your mind or thought.
This really sounds like the original manifestation idea. The belief that your internal state can physically change your external reality.
It is. And Ehrenreich points out the irony that this was, arguably a far less rational theory than the Calvinism it was replacing, but it offered immediate comfort. It gave people a sense of individual agency.
And it first found success not against something like cancer, but against neurasthenia.
Yes, a widespread syndrome of nervous exhaustion, especially among middle-class women who were sort of trapped in idleness by the old Calvinist worldview. New Thought offered them a talking cure, a way to believe their way out of their exhaustion.
It was psychological relief packaged as spiritual doctrine.
And that laid the groundwork for the secular version that came later. If thought can heal your body, why can it make you rich?
That shift was really catalyzed in the mid-20th century with figures like Norman Vincent Peale.
Right. Peale was a mainstream Protestant minister who basically took these New Thought ideas and ran with them.
He's the one who popularized the exact phrase, positive thinking, in his huge 1952 bestseller, The Power of Positive Thinking.
He essentially mechanized the concept. He moved the focus from just healing nervous exhaustion to solving everyday problems. Financial trouble, marital issues, business problems.
He gave people 10 simple, workable rules for mental reprogramming.
Exactly. Arguing that your problems were really just rooted in an inferiority complex. The solution wasn't to change the system. It was this rigorous, never-ending internal discipline to conquer your self-doubt.
So if we fast forward to when Bright-Sided was written, the late 2000s, Ehrenreich is critiquing the, manic crescendo of this whole ideology.
Yes. The corporate wellness industry, motivational coaching, the prosperity gospel, and most critically, the absolute frenzy of financial speculation that led right up to the 2007-2008 meltdown.
So the book's central thesis is that this entire apparatus, from the pink ribbons to the corporate consultants to the megachurch pastors, it all functions as one coherent system.
A self-reinforcing system of social control. That's it. Enforced optimism discourages critique, it normalizes extreme risk, and it aggressively blames the whiners or victims for huge structural failures.
That sets us up perfectly for the core systems analysis. Let's start with the book's distinction between hope and this disciplined, mandatory optimism.
This is such a critical distinction because it reveals the coercive nature of the system. Hope, as she defines it, is an emotion. It's a yearning, it's often passive, and it's fundamentally out of our control.
But optimism is presented as something different.
It's presented as a cognitive stance, a conscious expectation that you develop through endless practice and intense willpower.
So it's not enough to just feel good. You have to actively work at being positive.
You have to do the work, exactly. The ideology claims that if you practice expecting good things, they will happen, either through rational means, you become more effective, or through mystical means like the law of attraction.
But the book points out this deep paradox. I mean, if the universe was really on our side, if things were objectively getting better, why would we need so much exhausting effort to believe it?
The need for that constant vigilance is the giveaway. Positive thinking requires what its own gurus call self-hypnosis or mind control. It's an ideological discipline.
With actual techniques.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Reciting affirmations, constantly consuming self-help books, and even physically punishing yourself, like snapping a rubber band on your wrist every time a negative thought pops into your head.
That rubber band image, that really underscores the disciplinary part of it. It sounds less like self-care and more like an internalized form of psychological warfare against yourself.
It is exhausting internal labor. And that constant effort to censor your own inner monologue isn't driven by genuine confidence. Ehrenreich says it's driven by a terrible insecurity.
Because if you were truly secure, you wouldn't need to do it.
Exactly. The relentless effort reveals the underlying structural instability that is trying to paper over.
Okay, let's go back to the medical world for a minute, where Ehrenreich started this whole journey. Let's talk more about how this discipline moralizes illness.
Well, the mandatory positivity turns the whole process of recovery into a kind of moral litmus test. The emphasis on attitude means any setback, any failure, becomes evidence of a personal failing.
You're robbed of the right to have a rational fear or anger about your situation.
You are. And the pressure to engage in benefit finding, this idea that cancer is a gift or some profound learning opportunity, that becomes really damaging when it's enforced.
It's what she calls a massive empathy deficit.
Right. When friends or family push that narrative, they're basically just minimizing the patient's real burden and fear. The cheerfulness is often for their convenience, not the patient's well-being.
So the patient ends up doing even more emotional labor.
Exponentially more. Burying their valid emotions under this cosmetic layer of cheer to make everyone else comfortable.
So if the medical world uses this to manage the emotional costs of illness, the corporate world uses it to manage the financial costs of, well, downsizing.
Positive thinking became an absolutely indispensable management tool, especially after the mass layoffs started in the 1980s with figures like Neutron Jack Welch.
Corporations had two big problems, right? The scared people left behind and the angry people who were just laid off.
And their solution wasn't to offer job security. It was motivational content.
Right. They bring in speakers, hand out DVDs, and push books like Who Moved My Cheese?
The whole purpose of which was to reframe layoffs and benefit cuts, not as a corporate betrayal, but as an exciting change and an opportunity for you to reinvent yourself.
And the mechanism of control here is that the laid-off employee is told this is a chance to build the brand called you.
The language is so important. You're no longer a loyal team member. You're a disposable bundle of skills who has to constantly market yourself.
So if you get laid off, it's framed as your fault, a personal lack of enthusiasm or a negative attitude.
The consequence of systemic instability gets completely recast as a personal moral failing.
And the book points to a direct financial motivation for this, beyond just morale.
Oh, absolutely. She cites Bureau of Labor Statistics, estimates that U.S. companies lose something like $3 billion a year to negative attitudes and behaviors. Errors, lateness, rudeness.
So that number becomes the perfect quasi-scientific justification for getting rid of anyone who doesn't radiate positivity.
It reinforces the belief that negativity is literally costing the company money.
Which just drives home the commodification of emotion. That requirement to perform happiness must be just soul-crushing emotional labor.
It is. Remember that quote from the computer tech forced to be happy in a call center? He said it felt like getting a hand job when your soul is dying.
Wow.
That just perfectly captures the internal conflict, the despair of job insecurity being masked by this exhausting performance of cheerfulness demanded by management. It's a profound betrayal.
And this intense pressure to conform leads right to the biggest structural problem with all of this, the suppression of dissent and actual risk assessment.
When a system prioritizes cheerfulness, it actively rejects realism, and that has catastrophic consequences.
Ehrenreich points to the political sphere, like the Bush administration.
Yes. She says President George W. Bush almost demanded optimism. He hated pessimism, hand-wringing, or doubt. So his advisors, even smart people, were incentivized to withhold their worries to stay in his good graces.
And we saw the result of that culture in failures like 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina.
Afterwards, those failures were often blamed on a vague failure of imagination. But the book argues it was an ideological failure. The imagination was working overtime. It was just focused exclusively on American invulnerability and a perpetually booming economy.
So any warnings about the vulnerability of the World Trade Center or the weakness of the New Orleans levees were just swept aside as pessimism?
Because they didn't fit the national narrative of success. And this exact same purging of realism happens every day in the workplace.
Where managers are literally advised to get rid of negative people.
Which in practice often just means firing the annoying people who might actually have something useful to say. The financial officer who's worried about subprime mortgage exposure, the engineer who says the budget is too low, they become whiners.
Realists are treated as subversive.
Yes. And this suppression of realism brings us to the most devastating consequence the book covers, the 2008 financial collapse.
Where the virus of positive thinking proved lethal to the entire global economy.
The finance sector had embraced this anti-rational, almost mystical ethos. They'd abandoned what Ehrenreich calls dreary rationality, actually analyzing risk for intuition, charisma, and this idea that all good things come to those who are optimistic enough to expect them.
When top executives start believing their thoughts can control reality.
That debt and risk can just be wished away, the whole system becomes delusional.
And the book gives some really vivid examples of leaders who are living in this bubble.
Take Angelo Mozzillo, the CEO of Countrywide Mortgage. His reckless lending basically set off the whole crisis, and he stayed fanatically optimistic and upbeat even as his company was completely imploding.
He'd even won an award for it, right?
The Horatio Alger Award, which specifically celebrates the belief that hard work, determination, and positive thinking are key. A finance professor said people like Mozzillo are good at self-hypnosis. They convince themselves about the story. He just refused to believe mass defaults were possible.
And the few analysts who were being rational and realistic were punished for it.
Oh, completely. The book chronicles this pressure. Ivy Zillman, who saw the housing bubble bursting, said she alienated clients with her pessimism.
And Steve Eisman, famous for shorting the market, faced the same thing.
His colleagues said Upbeat and Eisman didn't occupy the same planet. He was criticized for daring to assign a sell rating on a company based on an honest assessment of risk.
He was operating on an outdated model where your job was to be honest, not to flatter the people at the top.
The system demanded conformity. And that conformity was incredibly expensive. The core failure was this belief that to think something is to make it happen. It led top executives to just ignore fundamental analysis.
A collective delusion that cost the global economy, what was it, $3 trillion in evaporated savings.
It's a perfect example of how mandated optimism goes from being a kind of benign self-help idea to being an engine of mass destruction.
And this was all reinforced by this almost religious faith in market fundamentalism.
The market itself became this kind of benevolent, self-correcting God, a lot like Mary Baker Eddy's vision of an all-supplying universe. Why worry about risk when the invisible hand will just magically fix everything?
The optimistic ideology and the neoliberal economic ideology were a perfect match.
They reinforced each other completely, creating a system where failure was literally unthinkable until it happened.
Okay, we've covered the consequences. Let's step back and really map the components of this system. How does this wheel keep spinning, even after a catastrophe like 2008?
Well, when we map the system of enforced optimism, we can break it down into three main parts: the actors, the incentives, and the narratives.
Okay, let's start with the actors. Who's keeping this system running?
First, you have the institutions and management. That's corporations doing downsizing, finance companies pushing reckless loans, the military planning invasions with, mandated confidence, and hospitals pushing that pink ribbon culture.
Then you have the people who are actively selling this ideology.
The promoters and industries.
Oh.
This is the huge self-help complex gurus like Rhonda Byrne from The Secret, Tony Robbins, Zig Ziglar. You've got tens of thousands of life coaches, evangelical pastors preaching the prosperity gospel.
Like Joel Osteen.
Joel Osteen, Creflo Dollar, and even key figures in academic positive psychology like Martin Seligman.
And finally, the subject of all this pressure, the average person.
Yes, the subject. Employees, patients, job seekers, middle-class consumers, the people who are compelled to adopt and perform the positive stance. They become the foot soldiers.
So what are the incentives? Why do people willingly sign up for this exhausting work?
There are systemic incentives and individual ones. At the systemic level, it ensures compliance and silence. It can generate short-term stock price boosts. It helps avoid confrontation in, say, a hospital. And it normalizes increasingly precarious conditions.
And for the individual, the promise is success and health.
Exactly. The individual incentives are the promise of material success. God wants you to be rich, better health, and critically, avoiding that damning label of victim or whiner.
Being called negative is seen as a bigger failure than actually being unprepared.
In this culture, yes, and the language itself is a weapon. The narratives are the maxims you hear everywhere,
Attitude determines outcome.
which just erases luck or context or systemic failure. Then there's everything happens for a reason, which is used to justify trauma. A job loss or an illness is always spun as a crisis is an opportunity.
And of course, the brand called you.
That constant corporate demand to market yourself.
Okay, so let's pull this all together. Let's talk about the feedback loop that keeps this system going, even after it fails so spectacularly.
The loop starts with systemic insecurity. You have rising debt, mass layoffs, a shrinking safety net. This insecurity creates a desperate demand for positive thinking as a kind of ideological substitute for a real safety net,
And then the system enforces compliance.
which leads to suppressed critique. Realists and dissenters are silenced. That silence then enables institutional recklessness, financial collapses, poor disaster planning, because no one is allowed to imagine a negative outcome.
And then, when the inevitable failure happens, the loop comes full circle.
It does. The failure leads to renewed individual blame. You failed because of your attitude, not the collapsing economy. So the system persists, even strengthened by the failure it caused, because the blame is just neatly deflected away from the institutions.
So it's that deep-seated anxiety that keeps the demand for positivity so high.
It offers this irresistible illusion of individual control. If you can't get a good job, you can at least control your perception of not having a good job.
And the alternative collective action is framed as what?
As either impractical and expensive, which is what some positive psychology figures have argued, or, more damningly, as just whining. It's a radical individualism that discourages you from ever looking outside yourself for solutions.
Looking at the present day, these mechanisms haven't gone away. They've just been refined and integrated, especially in workplace culture and the wellness industry.
The core issue is still this relentless commodification of emotion. Companies still use motivational products and team building to manage the despair of overworked survivors after a layoff.
It's not about addressing burnout, it's about managing the symptoms.
Right, and management uses it to beat up employees who fail to hit their goals. They'll say, "Didn't you listen to the speaker we brought in? You're clearly not being positive enough."
This mandated performance of happiness becomes this external requirement, totally divorced from your internal state of despair.
And this ties right into the moralization of mental health. The ideology says that anxiety or sadness isn't a rational response to, say, climate change or massive inequality.
But a moral or physical defect that needs to be corrected.
Exactly. The book critiques positive psychology for suggesting the human brain is catastrophic, evolved for the Pleistocene. The implication is that your anxiety about modern problems is an evolutionary malfunction, not a rational response.
So if the problem is your catastrophic brain, the only solution is constant internal work.
A constant search and destroy mission against negativity inside your own head. It's just as rigorous as the Calvinist search for sin, only now you're hunting for toxic thoughts.
And if the goal is happiness, then realism itself becomes subversive.
It does. The book talks about advice to limit your consumption of negative news, to banish negative people. Critics with rational, evidence-based concerns are just dismissed as big babies.
This hostility to realism is a form of social censorship, isn't it? It cuts the system off from vital feedback.
And it creates what she calls a massive empathy deficit. Nobody has time for anyone else's problems because they're too busy policing their own attitude and protecting their own positive illusions.
The culture just becomes atomized and self-obsessed.
And the cruel irony is that pessimism or realism is often demonstrably healthier and more successful in the long run.
Right. Realism is a survival tool.
Studies have shown that optimists take more foolish risks, whereas kids who were realistic about their social standing were less likely to get depressed later than the ones who had these persistent positive illusions. Realism prepares you for setbacks.
But if the system discourages realism, how does the scientific community sometimes play along?
Well, Ehrenreich points out that research funding often favors results that support the positive thinking narrative. She talks about foundations that fund research into optimism and health.
And a researcher admitted you don't get the award for a null result.
Exactly. You don't get anything for a null result. It incentivizes research that is deliberately spun to confirm the ideology. The science becomes less about discovery and more about providing a veneer of rigor to a pre-existing belief.
Okay, let's explicitly connect this back to our central theme here in Crisis in Perception. This book is all about a system that actively distorts our perception of reality.
It does it by promoting what are called positive illusions. Martin Seligman, a founder of positive psychology, even said the goal is to show the benefits of optimism at a cost perhaps of less realism.
The system demands you ignore empirical facts.
High incarceration rates, crumbling infrastructure, massive inequality. Ignore all that in favor of the emotional certainty that America is the greatest nation on earth. It's a comfortable national self-deception.
And it's fueled by ideologies that reward belief over evidence, often dressed up in quasi-scientific language.
The happiness equation is the perfect example. H equals S plus C plus V. Happiness equals your genetic set range plus your circumstances plus your voluntary effort.
And the trick is how they weight those variables.
The sleight of hand is assigning a tiny contribution to C, your circumstances, only 8 to 15%.
So that's the scientific justification for ignoring poverty, inequality, lack of healthcare.
It provides the veneer of science to say that if you're not happy or wealthy, it has almost nothing to do with your circumstances and everything to do with your lack of voluntary effort. It absolves institutions of all responsibility.
And this connects right back to the mystical stuff we talked about, like the law of attraction.
The system seamlessly integrates the mathematical illusion with magical thinking. The secret claims your thoughts can physically manifest a necklace. It all rewards unfounded belief, right up to the top executives who thought their optimism could prevent a housing market collapse.
So finally, let's revisit how positivity functions as censorship. How does this internal vigilance stop us from addressing real threats?
It works by turning vigilance entirely inward. It forces you to worry obsessively about your thoughts, the internal threat of negativity, instead of worrying about external threats like precarious employment or climate change.
It's mental discipline turned against the self to exhaust and distract you.
But the irony is that successful people in high-stakes jobs rely on the exact opposite approach.
Defensive pessimism.
Exactly. The book makes a compelling case that successful pilots, doctors, homicide detectives, engineers, they all practice defensive pessimism. They anticipate failure. They plan for the worst-case scenario.
Which is precisely what the positive thinking ideology forbids you to do.
Right. You want your surgeon to investigate the most dire possible diagnosis, not just the most optimistic one. Defensive pessimism is just common sense risk management. Our survival as a species depended on anxious vigilance, on anticipating threats. Positive thinking actively works against that fundamental instinct.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the book really forces a distinction between genuine hope and this disciplined, mandatory positive thinking.
Hope can exist alongside radical realism. You can accept the facts, the climate crisis is dire, that illness is uncertain, and still choose to act. But positive thinking demands self-deception.
It's different from what you might call existential courage.
Completely. The capacity to fight even when victory is uncertain, like the Founding Fathers signing the Declaration of Independence. They knew the risks. They acted despite the risk, not because they had visualized certain victory.
So Ehrenreich's case is that this emotional discipline is really a political tool for control.
Absolutely. She draws a parallel to Soviet historical optimism, which was used to enforce state ideology and suppress dissent. In modern America, it's been adapted by capitalism to manage a precarious workforce.
And the result is this seamless, self-enclosed world where your boss, your pastor, and your self-help guru are all delivering the exact same message.
And that devastating message is, if you are defeated, sick, or poor, you have only yourself to blame. It creates a world with no structural accountability, no mercy, no solidarity.
Which brings us to the final painful point. Why objective truth so often feels negative inside these systems.
Because realism requires you to acknowledge that the world is unfolding according to its own inner algorithms, without any regard for human feelings. Accepting that your thoughts don't control the stock market or stop a tumor, is seen as negative because it shatters the comforting illusion of ultimate control.
So what does this vigilant realism require? I mean, we use defensive pessimism every day to survive, checking our car, worrying about a toddler near an outlet. But the system wants us to redirect that energy inward.
And the book argues that the essential cultural shift is to recognize that the alternative to optimism is not despair, It's action. If we start spending all this energy on the exhausting internal work of forced positivity, we can redirect it externally. We can accept the reality of terrifying obstacles and shift our focus back to the collective work of building up the levees, strengthening our safety net, and addressing those real obstacles together.
That's a powerful challenge to a deeply ingrained cultural habit. We've been diving into Barbara Ehrenreich's essential read, Bright-Sided, how the relentless promotion of positive thinking has undermined America.
If this structural critique of American ideology caught your attention, we highly encourage you to seek out and read the book or borrow it from a library.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.